Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, Episode 101, The Promise. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters, and today I will present fantasy fiction of my own creation. This show is titled The Promise. And it's a story about a river rafting adventure, or rather a river canoe adventure. So, how does it begin? Well, it begins with a couple of teenagers, Timothy and Jeff. Well, what happened is coming up on a holiday. Well, this is fantasy fiction, so the holiday is fantasy fiction. It is kind of a cross between Easter and Thanksgiving, in the sense. It's like having Thanksgiving in the spring, I guess, is basically what it is. Kind of like a family get-together, where all the extended family members come from far and wide. So, in the case of Timothy's family, they were going to meet at his grandmother's house. Well, his grandmother's house was about 100 miles away down the river. So they were going to take a weekend journey to get there. So, actually probably was going to take more than a weekend, probably about maybe a whole week. But anyway, so they decided to get underway. So they made sure they had plenty of provisions for their journey. Tents, food, water, first aid kits. They wanted to be sure to be prepared. Of course, there occasionally were storms. After all, it was the spring. Sometimes heavy rains did occur. Well, they bought ponchos and tarps for their tent. They figured they were adequately prepared. Well, they set off for Timothy's grandmother's, Timothy and Jeff. Well, they started off on the Stony Brook River, which was only a couple miles from Jeff's house. So they got their canoe and they made their way to the river. Then they set out. Well, they went down the Stony Brook River. It was basically fairly peaceful as far as the water goes, a little bit slow, perhaps too peaceful. Other spots, it lived up to its name, and it was a little more rapid and with stones in the way. Well, the canoe bashed up on several of these stones, putting a few small dents in it. But since it was a metal canoe and it was holding up well, they continued on, Timothy and Jeff, down the Stony Brook River. So then it came to another calm spot, and they proceeded down there. And then finally they found their way, after 3 days, to the Hongaloo River. Well, they were almost halfway there. So now they started downstream on the Hongaloo. Well, the Hongaloo River is bigger than the Stony Brook River and faster. So they were able to cover more distance now. However, of course, everybody knows there's a problem with this stretch of the Hongaloo River, and that is, of course, Hongaloo Falls. Well, Hongaloo Falls is 3 waterfalls spread out over 4 miles. These waterfalls are each at least 30 feet high, with the tallest one being almost 100 feet high. Well, obviously they were going to have to hike this portion, so they did. And, well, it was getting late as they were in the woods hiking this portage, so to speak, to bypass the Hongaloo Falls, when it came nightfall. Well, as they approached nightfall, it was obvious they had to set up camp. So they found a place, a suitable location, a small clearing, and they set up camp. Well, they drifted off to sleep after eating a hearty meal of some local game that they were able to catch, and then cook on a campfire. Well, during the night, there was a storm, and the rain got heavy. It was really pouring when they got up. Gee, what a horrible mess. The cold rain pounded hard on their tents, and it was windy too. Absolutely horrible camping conditions. They woke up frustrated and upset, broke camp as quickly as they could. Everything a total mess, everything waterlogged. Well, they had to carry their heavy gear in the pouring rain as they continued their hike towards the Hongaloo River. Finally, after a couple of rain-soaked miles, they got there. Anyway, the rain was still heavy, even heavier now. However, the forecast called for heavy rain to continue throughout the day. And they figured, well, the river could get even more dangerous as time goes on, even though it was flowing rapidly and high right now. Gee, Jeff, Timothy said, have you ever ridden the Hongaloo when it was this high? Well, I guess almost this high, Jeff said. But that was a little bit of an exaggeration. Anyway, this really was a heavy rainstorm, and they just caught them in a bad spot in their travels. Well, they decided to proceed anyway, even though it looked a bit dangerous. They squeezed the water out of the gear as best as they could, and they got in their canoe and set downstream, going down the Hongaloo River. Well, they continued down the river. It was indeed fairly strong flowing. They were making good progress. Soon we'll be at grandmother's, Jeff said. Well, that's true, Timothy said. My grandmother only lives 30 more miles down the river, but at this rate we'll be there shortly. So they kept going rapidly down the river, bouncing over large waves, over the brown, tumultuous water. The water splashing in their face. The rain continued on, driving on. Well, then, Jeff brought up an old legend about a great whirlpool that was supposedly along the Hongaloo River, within the section they were traveling. Well, Timothy said he too heard of the old legend, but dismissed it, saying that such a fantastic whirlpool could not exist. And besides, Timothy said, I have never heard about it. Have you, Jeff? Well, Jeff said, no, I haven't heard about it, anyone seeing it, but, it is an old legend, so you never know. And the river is running pretty high. So they continued on. Then they hit a series of small rapids. They quickly bounced along over and over these humps of waves, almost being tossed off the boat. Oops, they lost a small package of their gear. What was that just went over? Jeff exclaimed. Timothy said it might have been their water. Anyway, they bounced along the river. And then it came to a calm area. Well, it seemed relatively calm. That is, they weren't bouncing along, and they were moving a little bit slowly than they were before. But then they noticed they were going into a turning motion. Timothy said, Jeff, why are you paddling to the right? Jeff said, I'm not paddling to the right. And then they started circling to the left. Jeff said, okay, well, now we're coming on course. But then they continued to the left. Hold on, what's going on here, Timothy said. I don't know, said Jeff. Then next thing you know, they were actually headed upstream. Oh no, it seems to be a whirlpool, Jeff said. Then the turning tightened. Timothy said, you're right. They started going faster and faster in a circle. And it seemed that they were also getting slightly lower, almost as if the river was sinking. They went around in circles faster and faster, getting tighter and tighter, until suddenly the craft was spinning rapidly on one point. Oh no, what do we do? Exclaimed Tim. I don't know, said Jeff. And next thing you know, the craft was sucked underwater. Well, Timothy was sucked under, along with Jeff and the canoe and all their gear. They went down rapidly, sinking. Their ears were hurting from the compression of the water. It was getting darker and darker. Well, they looked for each other. They couldn't see each other in the darkness, and they got separated. Timothy, struggled to get upward, swimming upward and trying to go downstream. He tried to get away from the center of the circle, the center of where the whirlpool was. He could feel it pulling against him. He fought it, trying to swim against it and going up at the same time. It was quite difficult, but after a while, Timothy finally made it to the surface, and he swam harder and harder, but he continued around in the whirlpool. Well, he swam as hard as he could. Slowly and slowly, he got towards the edge, and he was being circled around, slower and slower. We might have a little bit of audio disturbance due to Lucy, my cat, playing with a block nearby. Anyway, so Timothy finally made it out of the whirlpool and made it to the shore nearby. The rain was still raining. It was a little lighter now for the moment, but it was still quite windy. He looked around for Jeff and the canoe. He could see neither. But he was near the whirlpool, so he decided to stay there, looking for Jeff to emerge. He studied the river carefully. Meanwhile, Jeff was not as fortunate. He got just sucked down and down and down. And then he felt himself rising. He looked up and he saw a greenish light. He swam up towards it. Finally, I could breathe again. He burst through the surface. But he wasn't on the surface. No, Jeff was in an underground cave. But it was lit with this soft green light. It seemed almost as bright as daylight. It was quite strange indeed. So Jeff came up to the surface and got up on the rocks. They were all slimy. Finally, he got off to a few feet away from the water where he felt safe and lay down, exhausted. But then, as he slept, he felt a strange sensation come over his body. He did get a little bashed up, and his leg was hurt, and the side of his head was numbed. But he was exhausted, so he slept. And then he felt through the agony and the fantasy as he felt he was turning over and over as he remembered in his mind being sucked down the whirlpool. And in his dream, in his vision, as he was turning over and over, he felt he was losing his identity and falling into a circle of light of sorts. With this, he felt he was unifying with everything. It was a strange sensation. He felt larger than himself. He felt connected to nature. He felt connected to everyone, including Timothy. He could see Timothy there waiting near the riverbank. He tried to call out to Timothy. Well, Timothy couldn't hear him because he was dreaming. So Jeff continued in his dream as he unified with everything more and more. He felt empathy in a very strong and extreme sense. Jeff awoke from his dream. His leg still hurt. His side hurt too. His head was numb and funny feeling. He felt he was still in his dream though, even though he was awake. He felt unified with everything still. It was a really bizarre feeling. He felt he was larger than himself. He looked at his hand, but it seemed fuzzy. His whole body seemed fuzzy. Everything seemed kind of fuzzy. It would drift in and out, occasionally becoming clear and then becoming fuzzy again every few seconds. It was very strange and confusing. Jeff thought, oh no, how am I going to get back? What do I do? Is there a way to the surface through the cave itself? Or do I have to dive back down to the water and find my way up again through the whirlpool? Well, Jeff slowly became a little more orientated, feeling a little more sure of himself. His vision sharpened a little bit, and he felt like he could walk on. So he tried to go upward into the cave. The cave was lit with this soft green light, so he figured perhaps the surface wasn't that far away. so he kept going along. From the roof of the cave there were hung roots, and they hung almost to his head. And as he advanced, the roots got lower and lower. The cave got smaller and smaller, but yet it was still lit. He struggled through this. And then he started feeling strange again, like he was unified with everything. He felt like little beings were scurrying past him, talking to him, trying to explain something to him. As this happened, he felt more unified with everything, like he was unified with Jesus himself, and with God, and with all of creation. Jeff felt great hope and great possibility. And all of a sudden, one of these beings rushed past him like a little rat, kind of squeaking, except through his squeaking came a strange and bizarre message about the ephemeral value system. Ephemeral value system, what's that? Jeff said. Oh, it's the way a lot of people are, perhaps most people are, said the strange, squeaky voice. The ephemeral value system. Then the voice kicked into song, into poetry, and into verse, all at the same time. I forgot exactly how it went, but it was kind of a satirical song about how people didn't care about each other, how they only cared about their own gain, how nothing else mattered except that, what could get them through to the next day. That's why it was called the ephemeral value system. Everything was based on getting happiness for the short term, with nothing focused on long-term stability or values, just getting your happiness, whatever it might be. And, well, phooey on everything else. And so the being kept squeaking about that, squeaking how most people were like that, and how sad it was, and how they're losing out on so much more. Well, Jeff did sense that they were losing out, that he was losing out, and Timothy, their family, and everyone else. For Jeff felt unified again, as another being squeaked past him, this time squeaking about the wonderfulness of Title IV, of having empathy for each other, and being truly unified, taking responsibility for each other's actions, even though it's not your fault. Well, the song went on how people took things for granted. Everything was taken for granted in the ephemeral value system. However, in the reality of Title IV, with empathy, with this extreme sense of empathy, with this extreme sense of reality, everybody was united as one. Everybody knew everything, and everybody helped everyone, and everybody took responsibility for each other's actions, even when it wasn't their fault. And everybody was affected by each other's negative actions and each other's positive actions. It went on and on. The implications reverberating in Jeff's mind. It was incredible. It was wonderful. It was overwhelming. Oh no, Jeff thought, and suddenly came to his senses again. Gee, this is too much. I must make my way back. So, what happened is Jeff kept digging through the roots, through the light. Could he make it to the surface? He kept on digging. And then suddenly it got lighter. And he could see a way upward. He came up along the path and up and out into the woods. Now, Jeff had to find Timothy again. A sense of unreality washed over him, along with the wind and the rain. He wasn't even sure how it all came together at the end, in the form of a promise that if we came together and truly cared about one another, and think meant about or if these were the right woods. Perhaps he crossed over into another dimension somehow, Jeff thought. Well, gee, with all these weird visions and experiences I had, certainly it's possible. He thought about whatever had all this empathy for each other and took responsibility for each other and for each other's actions, even though they weren't our fault. If we truly did this in the most extreme sense and didn't care about our enjoyment or what's going to get us by to the next day, if we truly realized we were unified, well, then there was the promise of great things, of becoming, well, someone much bigger. Someone, well, bigger in the sense of having more responsibilities and more control over more things. For as you take responsibility for things, you have more influence over them as well. That was the message. That was the promise. If you take more responsibility, you'll have more influence. And working with God and working through love, everything will work out for the better. That was the promise. So Timothy was waiting for Jeff. He kept scanning the river. It's already been a couple hours. Timothy was really worried. Meanwhile, Jeff heard the rush of the river in the distance. As he crested a hill, he saw the river below and made his way down to it. Then he figured he should go upstream, for he thought that's where the whirlpool was. As he made his way upstream, he saw he saw Timothy rather, standing on the other side. They yelled across the river to each other, and both decided to make their way downstream. Well, they made their way downstream until the river came across an area with a bunch of rocks and logs where they could find their way across to one another. Timothy crossed over to Jeff's side and they continued downstream. They have lost their canoe and their gear and everything. And it was still another 20 miles to Timothy's grandmother's house. They walked on and on. Well, they even made it a day late for the great holiday, the cross between Easter and Thanksgiving, where everyone gets together. They were all quite worried about Timothy and Jeff, but they finally made it. Jeff's leg was still hurt, and he did have difficulty walking. His side was still hurt as well. His brain wasn't feeling so numb, but instead it was replaced with a pain and a big Casey Waters Show. Producer Casey Waters. Graphic editing Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2@CaseyWaters.com.